My son sold his dead mother's piano to buy a diamond ring. He hired movers in the middle of the night, dragged the only thing she had left in this world out through the front door, and left a note on the kitchen counter telling me to move on. His fiancée laughed when she saw the empty space in the living room. She called my wife's piano junk with strings. Then she looked at me and said, "Dead people do not need furniture." My son did not defend his mother. He did not even look ashamed. He just stood there holding the receipt, because to him, the memory of the woman who gave him life had become the perfect currency for a ring his fiancée could show off at a country club in Chicago. But a few days later, when the auction house opened the old wooden bench, they found something my wife had hidden before she died, a sealed envelope. My son thought he had sold a piano. What he had really done was trigger the final trap his mother left behind. This is not a story about a stolen instrument. This is not a story about a greedy daughter-in-law or a father who could not let go of the past. It is a story about a 34-year-old man who thought he could erase his family's history to buy his way into high society. And the exact moment he realized that the woman he thought he had buried had left one final trap waiting for him. There is a specific kind of betrayal that only your own flesh and blood can inflict. A stranger can break your window and steal your television, but only your son can look you in the eye, take the most sacred thing you own, and tell you he is doing you a favor. You need to hear how this ends. Because some debts cannot be paid with money. Some debts cost you everything. I did not build an empire by acting on impulse. When you spend 40 years turning a single, drafty piano repair shop on the south side of Chicago into Bennett Hale Music Holdings, a silent conglomerate that owns concert halls, restoration workshops, and classical music catalogs across the country, you learn to have patience. You learn to let the music play out. My name is Arthur Bennett. I am 71 years old. I drive a 10-year-old sedan. I wear suits that have been tailored and repaired more times than I can count, and I live in the exact same 4-bedroom brick house in Evanston, Illinois, that I bought with my wife Eleanor 40 years ago. Nobody in my neighborhood knows what my bank accounts look like. The teenager who delivers my newspaper does not know that I hold the controlling shares in a company that dictates the acoustic standards of half the symphony halls in the Midwest. And more importantly, my son's fiancée, Celeste, did not know. Celeste Whitmore was 29 years old, with the kind of aggressively manicured aesthetic that requires constant financial maintenance. She was beautiful, sharp, and deeply obsessed with the perception of wealth. To her, I was just Evan's sad, aging father who lived in a dusty old house and refused to modernize. Evan, my son, was 34. He was a junior vice president at a logistics firm, a title that sounded impressive, but mostly meant he worked 60 hours a week to afford a lifestyle he could not actually sustain. He was a social climber. He wanted the corner office, the imported car, the membership at the Oak Brook Golf Club. I loved my son. I still love my son. But I saw the shift in him years ago. When Eleanor was alive, she was the gravity that kept him grounded. She was a pianist, a music teacher, and the very soul of our family. But when she passed away 4 years ago after a brutal wasting illness, Evan did not just lose his mother. He lost his moral anchor, and when he met Celeste, he began to view his background, our quiet, unassuming life, as an embarrassment. He wanted to rewrite his history. He wanted to be a man born into luxury, not a man whose parents counted pennies in the dark so they could afford to keep the heat on. The centerpiece of our home was Eleanor's piano. It was a 1928 Steinway Model M, mahogany finish, sitting in the exact center of our front parlor. It was the first major purchase I ever made for her, back when Bennett Hale was nothing but a dream and a pile of debt. For decades, that piano was the heartbeat of the house. I could sit in the kitchen, listening to her play Chopin nocturnes in the evening, and know exactly what kind of mood she was in based on the tempo. She taught Evan how to play his first scale on those keys. When she was sick, when she could no longer walk without help, I would carry her to the piano bench just so she could feel the ivory under her fingers one last time. After she died, I kept it perfectly tuned. Every Thursday at 9 in the morning, a technician would come to the house. Every evening, I would wipe down the wood with a microfiber cloth. I kept her framed photograph on top of it. I did not play it, because I do not have the gift, but the piano was not an object to me. It was a monument. It was the physical manifestation of 40 years of marriage. Evan knew this. He knew exactly what that piano meant to me. Which is why the dinner on that particular Tuesday evening felt so utterly devastating. I had invited Evan and Celeste over for dinner to celebrate their recent engagement. I spent 3 hours in the kitchen, roasting a chicken with rosemary and garlic, peeling potatoes by hand, preparing a meal the way Eleanor used to do it. The house smelled like thyme and roasting butter. I had set the dining room table with the good silver. The plates we only used for holidays. I wanted to show my son that I supported him, even if I had my reservations about the woman he had chosen to marry. They arrived 20 minutes late. Celeste walked through the front door shivering, wearing a designer trench coat that cost more than my first car. She did not bring wine. She did not bring dessert. She simply walked into the entryway, handed me her coat without looking me in the eye, and stepped into the parlor. The parlor was dimly lit, the street lamps from the Evanston sidewalks casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. In the center of the room, the Steinway gleamed in the low light. Eleanor's photograph smiled out from the top of the lid. Celeste stopped in the middle of the room. She looked at the piano. She wrinkled her nose, a small, involuntary reflex of disgust, as if she had just stepped in something unpleasant on the sidewalk. "God, Evan," she said, her voice echoing too loudly in the quiet house. "This thing makes the whole room smell like a funeral home." I froze in the doorway, holding her heavy wool coat. I waited for my son to say something. I waited for the boy who used to sit on that very bench and laugh as his mother played silly ragtime tunes to defend her memory. Evan chuckled. It was a weak, hollow sound, a concession. He slid his hands into his pockets and looked away from the piano, refusing to meet my eyes. "It's just old wood, Celeste. Dad refuses to update the decor." I walked into the room, feeling the familiar, cold weight of disappointment settling in my chest. "That is your mother's piano, Evan," I said. My voice was calm. I have never been a man who shouts. Shouting is for people who have lost control of the narrative. Celeste turned to look at me, a tight, patronizing smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. "Arthur, it's massive. It completely ruins the feng shui of the room. I mean, honestly, it should be in a museum. Or a dump. You could put a beautiful minimalist sculpture right there. Something that actually breathes." I looked at Celeste. I looked at the way she held herself. The artificial confidence of someone who believes that a high credit limit equates to high character. And then I looked at my son. Evan was staring at the floor, perfectly willing to let this woman desecrate the most important object in his family's history because he was terrified of looking unrefined in front of her. "We are going to eat," I said quietly, turning toward the dining room. The dinner was an exercise in endurance. The roasted chicken was perfectly cooked, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. Celeste spent the first 30 minutes talking exclusively about the engagement party she was planning. It was going to be held at a private rooftop venue downtown. There would be a string quartet. There would be ice sculptures. She listed the names of the guests, a roster of minor local celebrities, influencers, and wealthy heirs she had desperately cultivated relationships with. "It has to be perfect," Celeste said, taking a microscopic sip of water. "My friends have expectations. You only get one chance to launch a marriage." "And the ring?" I asked, looking at Evan. He had not proposed with a ring yet. They were engaged in principle, but the physical token was still missing. Evan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of his expensive tailored shirt. "We're looking at a few options, Dad." Celeste has her heart set on a 3-carat cushion cut from a boutique in the Gold Coast. It's an investment piece, Arthur. Celeste chimed in, cutting her chicken into tiny, aggressive squares. A ring communicates value. It tells the world what kind of future Evan can provide. Evan leaned forward, his elbows on the table. He finally looked me in the eye, and I saw the desperation there. The pathetic, clawing hunger of a man who was drowning in his own ambition. The thing is, Dad, my liquid assets are a little tied up right now with a deposit on the venue and the caterer. I was wondering if we could talk about an advance on my inheritance. Just to cover the ring. It would mean a lot to us. The silence in the dining room was absolute. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I looked at my son. I looked at the boy I had raised, the boy who used to help me sweep the floors of the repair shop. Now asking me to fund a piece of carbon to impress a woman who thought his mother's memory belonged in a landfill. I set my fork down on the porcelain plate. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my fists on the table. I simply looked at him and delivered the truth. A ring bought with someone else's sacrifice is not a promise, Evan, I said, my voice low and steady. It is a receipt. Celeste's fork stopped moving. She stared at me, her eyes narrowing, the polite mask slipping to reveal the cold calculation underneath. Evan's face flushed bright red. The embarrassment morphed instantly into defensive anger. He pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floorboards. Jesus, Dad, why do you always have to do this? Why does everything have to be a moral lecture? I'm just asking for a little help to start my life. You are asking me to finance an illusion, I replied. I will not do it. An illusion? Evan snapped, his voice rising, the polished veneer cracking. Because I want something nice. Because I don't want to live in a dark, depressing house worshipping old furniture for the rest of my life. You're suffocating in here, Dad. Mom is gone. She's been gone for 4 years. And you're still acting like she's going to walk through the door and play that stupid piano. You are entirely trapped in the past. Evan, that's enough, Celeste said, standing up. She didn't sound angry. She sounded bored, like she was dealing with an unruly child at a grocery store. Let's go. We have a tasting with the caterer tomorrow anyway. Evan stood up, throwing his linen napkin onto his half-eaten plate. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. You know, Mom would have wanted me to build a future. She would have wanted me to move on. She wouldn't want you sitting here in the dark, guarding a pile of junk. He used her. He used the memory of my dead wife to justify his own pathetic vanity. It was a violation so profound that I could not even formulate a response. I sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the smell of roasted rosemary, and watched my son walk out the front door. I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaking of the old house. I thought about the days when Evan was small. I thought about Eleanor's laugh, bright and echoing through the parlor. I thought about the terrible, corrosive nature of greed, and how it can hollow out a person from the inside until there is nothing left but appetite. I finally drifted into a restless sleep around 3 in the morning. I did not hear the heavy truck pull up to the curb. I did not hear the key turning in the front door lock, the spare key I had given Evan years ago for emergencies. I did not hear the heavy footsteps on the hardwood or the grunts of the men as they lifted the mahogany frame. I woke up at 7 in the morning to the sound of rain lashing against the bedroom window. The house felt unusually cold. There was a draft coming from the first floor. I put on my robe and walked slowly down the stairs. The front door was locked, but I could feel a strange, hollow emptiness in the air, a vibration that was missing. I walked into the parlor, tying the belt of my robe, and stopped dead in my tracks. The center of the room was empty. The Steinway Model M was gone. Where the grand, sweeping curve of the mahogany once sat, there was nothing but a large, rectangular patch of clean hardwood, surrounded by the faint outline of dust that had accumulated over the years. The heavy, ornate piano bench was gone. The only thing left behind was Eleanor's framed photograph. It was lying face down on the floor, the glass cracked diagonally across the center, abandoned in the rush to remove the instrument. I walked slowly into the kitchen. My chest felt tight, a physical pressure pressing down on my lungs. On the kitchen island, sitting perfectly centered on the granite countertop, was a folded piece of white paper. I picked it up. The handwriting was Evan's. Sharp, hurried, unapologetic. Dad, I know you're going to be angry, but you need to understand that this is for the best. That piano was doing nothing but taking up space and keeping you anchored to a ghost. I'm liquidating it to cover the ring and the venue deposit. It's what Mom would have wanted. She always said I should aim high. I'm building a future, not worshipping furniture. I'll call you when you've cooled down. Evan. I stood in the kitchen, holding the note. I did not scream. I did not throw a glass against the wall. I simply walked back into the parlor, knelt down on the hardwood floor, and picked up my wife's broken photograph. I brushed a shard of glass away from her smiling face. My son thought he had stolen an old piano. He thought he had taken a piece of neglected furniture to fund his desperate climb up the social ladder. He thought he had outsmarted a sad, foolish old man. But what he had really taken was the one object in this entire world that his mother had legally protected from him. He had just stolen his own execution warrant. And he was about to deliver it directly to the auction block. I stood in the center of the parlor for a long time, staring at the empty space on the floor. I did not immediately pick up the phone. I did not rush to the police station to file a report. The man who reacts first almost never wins. A half-told lie is just an argument. A fully told lie is a confession. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and dialed my son's number. He answered on the second ring. He sounded completely unfazed, his voice bright and crisp over the line, probably driving to work in his leased German sedan. Hey, Dad, did you see the note? Look, before you get upset, let me just explain. Where is it, Evan? I asked. My voice was completely flat. There was no rage in it, only a vast, terrible emptiness. Evan let out a long, theatrical sigh. I told you in the note. I liquidated it. It's for the best, Dad. Honestly, Celeste made a good point. The house felt like a mausoleum. You need to clear out some of that old energy if you ever want to move on. It was just wood, Dad. Stop acting like Mom was still sitting there. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. He was not just selling a piece of furniture. He was aggressively trying to rewrite our family's history to suit the narrative of his new, affluent life. I am not asking for your psychological assessment, Evan, I said quietly. I am asking for the location of the piano. I sent it to the Greer and Holloway auction house downtown, Evan said, a hint of smug pride creeping into his voice. Turns out you were sitting on a gold mine. The appraiser took one look at it and said it's going to fetch a premium because of the 1928 manufacturing date. The advance they gave me was enough to cover the down payment on the ring and the string quartet for the party. Everyone wins. You sold your mother's piano to an auction house, I repeated, making sure the words hung in the air between us. I capitalized on an asset, Evan corrected smoothly. Look, I have a morning meeting. I'll see you at the engagement party on Friday, okay? Try to be happy for me, Dad. For once. He hung up. I set the phone down on the counter. If you have been listening to my story, I want you to pause right here and drop a comment below. What would you do in this situation? If you found out your son sneaked into your home in the middle of the night, dragged away the most sacred memory you had of your dead wife, and used it to buy a diamond ring for a woman who despised you, would you scream? Would you call the police? Hit the like button while you think about it. Because what I did next was much, much worse than calling the police. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for Nora Chen. Nora was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless law firms in Chicago. But more importantly, she was the sole trustee of the Eleanor Bennett Memorial Trust. When I told her what Evan had done, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. He sold it? Nora asked. Her voice was usually completely stripped of emotion, but I could hear the genuine shock bleeding through. Arthur, are you absolutely certain the piano has left the property and the sale is in motion? I am certain, I said. He signed the consignment paperwork this morning with Greer and Halloway. Arthur, Nora said softly. You know what this means. You know what the codicil says. I know, I replied, staring out the kitchen window at the gray Chicago morning. My wife, Eleanor, was not just a musician. She was a brilliant judge of character. She saw the ambition growing in our son years before I did. She saw how he looked at our modest house with disdain. She knew that when she died, Evan might view her legacy not as a memory to be cherished, but as a vault to be emptied. And she refused to let him inherit the empire we had built if he did not understand the value of the blood and sweat it took to build it. Eleanor did not leave Evan money. She left him a test. The terms of the trust were brutally simple. If Evan ever sold, destroyed, or attempted to personally profit from Eleanor's personal memorial artifacts without my explicit, written consent, he would immediately trigger a forfeiture clause. He would be permanently removed as a beneficiary of Bennett Hale Music Holdings. Evan thought he was securing his financial future by selling that piano. He did not know that by treating his mother's memory as a commodity, he had just legally severed himself from a $42 million inheritance. He had just failed the test. I need to call the auction house immediately, Nora said, the lawyer in her taking over. I have the legal authority to freeze the sale. The piano belongs to the trust, not to him. The transaction is completely invalid. We can have it returned to your house by this afternoon. No, I said. Arthur, if we don't freeze the sale, if we freeze the sale right now, Nora, Evan will lie, I said, my voice hardening. He will say it was a misunderstanding. He will cry. He will blame Celeste. He will apologize in private and beg for another chance, and he will learn absolutely nothing. I did not want a private apology. I did not want my son to slink back into my house and pretend he was sorry because he got caught. He wanted to sell his mother's memory to buy a seat at a table of high society. He wanted an audience for his new life. Before I could explain further, a second call beeped through on my line. I looked at the caller ID. It was a downtown Chicago number. Hold on, Nora, I said, clicking over. Hello? Mr. Bennett? A voice asked. This is Samuel Greer from Greer and Halloway Auction House. I apologize for calling you directly, but we have a bit of a situation regarding the Steinway Model M your son brought in this morning. My grip tightened on the phone. Has it been damaged? No, sir. The instrument is in immaculate condition, Samuel said quickly. But it is our standard protocol to fully inspect antique pieces for provenance verification. When our technicians were examining the matching piano bench, they noticed an irregularity in the upholstery lining underneath. My heart stopped. We carefully removed the bottom panel, assuming we might find old sheet music, Samuel continued, his voice dropping an octave, sounding deeply uncomfortable. Instead, we found a large, heavy envelope glued to the interior wood. It is completely sealed. What does it say? I whispered. I heard the rustle of paper over the line. Samuel cleared his throat. It says for Evan. Only when he forgets what this piano was worth. Mr. Bennett, I am looking at the signature, and it appears to match the provenance documents are for Eleanor Bennett. We have not opened it, but given the circumstances, I felt I needed to contact you before we proceed with any cataloging. I closed my eyes. The tears I had been fighting all morning finally slipped down my face. My beautiful, brilliant wife. Even in death, she had planned for this. She knew that if Evan ever reached a point where he viewed her piano as garbage, he would sell it, and she made sure that when he did, he would find out exactly what he had thrown away. I knew exactly what was inside that envelope because I had helped her seal it 4 years ago. Inside that thick manila paper was a handwritten letter from a dying mother to a lost son. But there was also a legal copy of the original trust codicil. the original founding stock certificates of Bennett Hale, and a photograph of a 7-year-old Evan sitting on that very bench, laughing as his mother taught him how to play the C major scale. "Mr. Greer," I said, my voice shaking slightly before I forced it back into a calm, steady rhythm. "Do not open the envelope. Do not tell my son you have found it. And do not process the sale." "Understood, sir," Samuel said. "What would you like us to do with the piece?" I looked at the empty space on my parlor floor. I thought about the engagement party. I thought about Celeste laughing at the empty space and my son standing there, trading his mother's soul for a piece of jewelry. "The engagement party is this Friday night at the Grandview Country Club," I said. "I want you to bring the piano bench to the party. Do not bring the piano, just the bench, and bring the envelope." I clicked back over to Nora. "Nora," I said, "dress well this Friday. We are going to a party." The engagement party was 3 nights away. My son wanted an audience for his new life. So I decided to give him one for his old one. The Grandview Country Club was the kind of establishment that prided itself on exclusivity. It sat on a manicured hill in the northern suburbs, a sprawling estate of white pillars, valet parking, and members who spoke softly because they were used to being listened to. When I pulled my 10-year-old sedan up to the front entrance on Friday evening, the young valet in the crimson vest hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking my keys. He assumed I was lost. I did not blame him. I was wearing a charcoal wool suit that Eleanor had bought for me a decade ago. It was clean, it was pressed, but it did not carry a designer label. I walked into the main ballroom, taking in the spectacle my son had chosen over his family's history. Celeste had spared no expense, though I suspected she was relying heavily on the deposit Evan had secured from the auction house. The room was bathed in soft amber light. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner. Waiters in pristine white coats circulated with trays of champagne flutes and miniature caviar blinis. In the center of the room, there was a massive ice sculpture of a swan, already beginning to sweat under the chandeliers. I found Evan near the bar. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit him perfectly. He looked handsome. He looked like the man he had always desperately wanted to be. Celeste was standing next to him, wearing a white silk gown that swept the floor, her hair swept up in an intricate, flawless style. She was holding court, surrounded by a group of well-dressed friends and minor local influencers she had invited to ensure the event was properly documented on social media. I approached them quietly. I did not want to cause a scene. Not yet. "Arthur," Celeste said, noticing me first. Her smile did not reach her eyes. It was a tight, calculated expression. "You made it." We were starting to wonder. "I am on time, Celeste," I replied evenly. "Congratulations to you both." Evan looked at my suit. He looked at my worn leather shoes. I saw the familiar flash of embarrassment crossed his face, quickly masked by a forced, hearty laugh. "Glad you could make it, Dad. Look, we have you seated at table 12. It's near the terrace doors. Better breeze over there." Table 12 was the furthest table from the center of the room. It was situated near the kitchen exit, a place designed to keep the less desirable guests out of the background of the professional photographs. "Thank you, Evan," I said. "That sounds fine." Before I could walk away, a woman in a glittering emerald dress, one of Celeste's friends, leaned in. "So, Arthur," she said loudly, the champagne slurring her words just a fraction. "Evan tells us your late wife was quite the musician. Did she play professionally?" I looked at the woman. Then I looked at Evan. "She was a teacher," I said softly. "She believed music was a gift to be shared, not a product to be sold." Celeste let out a sharp, high-pitched laugh that cut through the polite murmur of the room. She placed a manicured hand heavily on Evan's chest, turning to her friend. "Oh, she was very musical. That's actually how we afforded the down payment on the ring. We decided to liquidate her massive, depressing piano. Honestly, we prefer investments that appreciate in value, rather than collecting dust." I waited for it. I waited for my son, the boy Eleanor had carried for 9 months, the boy she had sung to sleep every night, to step in. I waited for him to defend the mother who had given him everything. Evan did not look down. He did not look ashamed. He looked around at Celeste's wealthy friends, saw that they were smiling, and he chuckled. "Celeste is right," Evan said smoothly, taking a sip of his drink. "Mom would have wanted us to focus on the future. The piano was just a piece of wood. This ring," he gestured to Celeste's hand, which she dramatically lifted for the group to admire, "is a legacy." The ring was vulgar. It was a massive 3-carat cushion-cut diamond that caught the chandelier light and threw rainbows across the walls. It was the physical embodiment of a broken trust. "Exactly," Celeste beamed, raising her voice so the surrounding tables could hear. "This ring means Evan finally stopped clinging to that poor family sentiment. He chose our future over his father's museum of grief." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply nodded slowly, turning away from them, and walked to table 12. I sat in silence for 45 minutes. I watched my son laugh. I watched him pose for photographs. I watched him perform the role of a wealthy aristocrat, completely unaware that he was standing on a trapdoor, and his mother was holding the lever. At 8:30, Celeste tapped her champagne glass with a silver spoon. The sharp, high-ringing sound silenced the room. The string quartet stopped playing. The waiters paused by the walls. "Thank you all so much for being here," Celeste said, her voice echoing perfectly across the ballroom. She was standing in the center of the room, Evan wrapping his arm around her waist. "Tonight is about looking forward. It is about building a life that is beautiful, uncompromising, and absolutely perfect. Evan, darling, would you like to say a few words before we cut the cake?" Evan smiled, taking the microphone from the DJ. "I just want to say how lucky I am to find a woman who pushes me to be better, who showed me that it is okay to let go of the past and demand more from the future." He was about to continue. He was about to give a sweeping toast to his own ambition, but he never got the chance. The heavy, oak double doors of the ballroom swung open with a loud, resounding thud. Every head in the room turned. Standing in the doorway was Nora Chen. She was wearing a razor-sharp black suit, holding a leather briefcase. Beside her stood Samuel Greer, the auctioneer, wearing his own formal attire. But they were not alone. Between them, they were carrying a heavy, scuffed, mahogany piano bench. The visual contrast was jarring. In a room full of silk, diamonds, and ice sculptures, the old, worn piece of furniture looked like a piece of debris that had washed up on a pristine beach. The silence in the room deepened. Nora and Samuel walked slowly across the ballroom floor. The legs of the piano bench scraped slightly against the polished marble. They did not stop until they reached the exact center of the room, setting the bench down on the floor directly in front of Evan and Celeste. Celeste stared at the wooden bench, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure outrage. The mask had finally slipped. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shrill and echoing. "Who are you? Get this ugly, disgusting furniture out of my party immediately." Evan's face had gone completely pale. He recognized the bench. He recognized the specific scratch marks on the side from where he used to kick his heels against it as a child. "Dad," Evan stammered, looking wildly toward table 12. "Dad, what is going on? Did you do this?" I stood up. I buttoned my charcoal wool jacket. I walked slowly across the silent ballroom, feeling the eyes of every single guest on me. I did not look at Celeste. I did not look at the wealthy influencers or the string quartet. I looked only at my son. I stopped in front of the piano bench. I reached down and rested my hand on the worn mahogany lid. "Before my son gives his fiancée a ring bought with his mother's piano," I said, my voice low, steady, and carrying the weight of 4 years of grief, "I think he should open the bench she left behind." The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the ice sculpture melting, water dripping softly onto the linen tablecloth. Evan stared at the worn piano bench, then at me. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the shocked faces of Celeste's friends, the influencers with their phones suddenly lowered, and the absolute terrifying calm on Nora Chen's face. "Open the bench, Evan," Celeste scoffed, her voice high and brittle. She tried to laugh, but it sounded like glass breaking. "Arthur, what is this? Some kind of weird family therapy exercise?" "We are in the middle of a toast. The toast is over, Miss Whitmore," Nora said, stepping forward. Her voice was designed for boardrooms and courtrooms, cutting through the silence with absolute authority. "I am Nora Chen, the trustee of the Eleanor Bennett Memorial Trust. I am here to formally inform Evan Bennett that the attempted sale of the 1928 Steinway Model M to Greer and Halloway Auction House is invalid. The asset did not belong to him. It belonged to the trust." Evan blinked, the color draining from his face completely. "What are you talking about? It was my mother's piano. She died. That makes it mine." "No, Evan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, though it carried across the entire room. "It made it your responsibility." "This is insane!" Evan snapped, his voice rising in panic. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You're doing this to humiliate me. Because I didn't want to live in a mausoleum. Because I wanted to buy a ring for my fiancée." "You wanted to buy a ring," Samuel Greer, the auctioneer, said quietly. He stepped forward and placed his hand on the mahogany lid of the bench. "And you told us it was simply old furniture taking up space. But when my team inspected the bench for cataloging, we found this." Samuel lifted the lid of the piano bench. The hinges creaked, a sound that felt deafening in the vast ballroom. He reached inside and pulled out the thick manila envelope. The seal was unbroken. "It has your name on it." "Evan," Samuel said, holding it out. Evan didn't move. His hands were shaking. He looked at the envelope like it was a loaded weapon. "Take it," I commanded. Slowly, Evan reached out and took the envelope. He broke the wax seal. He reached inside and pulled out a stack of papers. There was a legal document, the trust codicil, and a founding stock certificate for Bennett Hale Music Holdings. But on top of those was a piece of heavy, cream-colored stationery. It was covered in Eleanor's elegant, looping handwriting. "Read it," I said. "Dad, please, not here," Evan whispered, his eyes scanning the first few lines, his face twisting in sudden, visceral horror. "Not in front of everyone." "You wanted an audience for your new life," I said, my voice cold and hard as iron. "Read it to them." Evan swallowed hard. His hands were shaking so violently the paper rattled. He looked at who was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. Then, he looked down at his mother's final words and began to read aloud. "My sweet boy, if you are reading this, it means the piano has left the house for the wrong reason. I hope I am wrong. I hope you gave it to someone who loved music. But if you sold it because you thought memory was useless, if you sold it because you were ashamed of where we came from, then I need you to know something. This piano was never furniture. It was where I held you when you cried. It was where your father and I counted pennies in the dark when the company almost failed, praying we could afford to buy you winter boots. It was where you played your first wrong note, and I clapped anyway. If you can sell that for a ring, then you are not ready to inherit what we built." Evan's voice broke on the last line. A tear slipped down his cheek, dropping onto the ink. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, pleading. Nora Chen did not give him a moment to recover. She stepped into the center of the room. Pursuant to the morality and respect clause outlined in the Eleanor Bennett Memorial Trust, Evan Bennett has violated the terms of inheritance by attempting to liquidate a protected memorial asset for personal, non-approved financial gain. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Evan has been permanently removed as a beneficiary of Bennett Hale Music Holdings. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. Celeste stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. "Removed?" Evan choked out. "What do you mean, removed?" "I mean you get nothing, Evan," I said. "Your mother and I built a company that controls half the acoustic venues in the Midwest. We built it from nothing. She wanted you to have it. But she knew that if you could not respect a piece of wood that held her memory, you would never respect the people who worked for us. The inheritance transfers immediately to the Eleanor Bennett Foundation. Wait, Celeste said, her voice suddenly sharp and panicked. She stepped forward, ignoring the tears on Evan's face. She looked directly at Nora. What about the ring? He paid for the deposit on the ring and the venue with the auction money. Ah, Nora said, her expression turning into a cold smile. Yes, because Evan did not legally own the piano, the sale to Greer and Halloway is void. The funds he received were misappropriated proceeds from a protected trust. The money must be returned immediately. If the money has already been spent on a deposit for a diamond ring, then the jeweler will be notified that the funds were acquired through fraudulent liquidation. Celeste froze. She looked down at her hand. She looked at the massive, 3-carat cushion-cut diamond that she had been showing off to her wealthy friends all night, the ring she had used to mock my wife's memory. It wasn't a symbol of a wealthy future. It was stolen property. You told me this was family money, Celeste hissed, her voice vibrating with pure venom. It was supposed to be, Evan cried, reaching for her arm. Celeste, I didn't know. I can fix this. We can get a loan. Don't touch me, Celeste snapped, recoiling as if he had burned her. In front of her friends, in front of the influencers, in front of the string quartet that was no longer playing, Celeste Whitmore took the diamond ring off her finger. She didn't hand it to Evan. She turned and dropped it directly into a half-empty flute of champagne sitting on the nearest table. It hit the bottom of the glass with a sharp, heavy clink. I don't marry liabilities, Celeste said. She turned on her heel, her white silk gown sweeping across the floor, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. The silence in the room was absolute. Evan collapsed onto his knees in the middle of the dance floor. He was surrounded by the ice sculpture, the champagne, the wealthy friends who were already whispering and backing away from him. He had nothing. He had traded his soul for a seat at the table, and the table had just been pulled out from under him. He looked up at me from the floor, tears streaming down his face, clutching the letter to his chest. Dad, please, he sobbed, his voice raw and broken. Mom would have forgiven me. You know she would have. She loved me. I looked down at the boy I had raised. I looked at the tailored tuxedo that he could no longer afford and the tear-stained paper in his hands. Your mother already gave you forgiveness, Evan, I said quietly, the truth of it settling heavily in my chest. That letter was the warning. You sold the warning. I turned away from him and began to walk toward the exit. You did not sell your mother's piano, Evan, I said, not looking back. You sold the last proof that you still understood what love was worth. The aftermath of the engagement party was swift, brutal, and entirely of Evan's own making. By Monday morning, Nora Chen had formally voided the transaction with Greer and Halloway. The 1928 Steinway Model M was loaded back onto a padded truck and returned to my possession, but I did not have the movers place it back in the front parlor. The rectangular patch of clean hardwood remained in the center of the room, a quiet, lingering reminder of what had been broken. Evan lost everything over the course of a single weekend. Celeste initially tried to orchestrate a highly effective social execution, reframing the story online as if she had been deceived. She told everyone in her circle that Evan was a fraud who stole his mother's furniture. But her plan backfired spectacularly. One of her own friends had been recording the party for social media and captured the exact moment Celeste called my wife's piano junk with strings and said dead people didn't need furniture. By the end of the week, the same influencers who had praised her ring were replaying that clip on loop. They labeled her the woman who mocked a dead mother for a diamond. By Wednesday, Evan's logistics firm suggested he take an indefinite leave of absence, and Celeste was forced to delete every single one of her social media accounts in utter humiliation. He was entirely cut off from the Eleanor Bennett Memorial Trust. He had no fiancé, no status, no inheritance, and no dignity. 3 weeks passed in total silence. I went about my routine. I drank my black coffee. I read the morning paper. I did not call him. I knew that a man who has lost his entire identity needs time to sit in the wreckage before he can figure out how to stand back up. On a rainy Thursday evening, I heard a knock at the front door. I opened it to find Evan standing on the porch. He was not wearing a custom-tailored suit. He was wearing a faded gray sweatshirt and jeans. He looked exhausted, the sharp, ambitious edges of his face hollowed out by grief and regret. He looked at me, shivering slightly in the cold autumn air. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside. He walked into the hallway. Taking off his wet shoes, he walked slowly toward the front parlor, stopping at the exact edge of the room. He stared at the empty space on the floor, at the faint outline of dust where the mahogany legs used to rest. He stood there for a long time. The silence between us stretched out, heavy with the weight of the last 4 years. "I tried to call Celeste," Evan finally whispered, his voice cracking. "She blocked my number. Her friends won't even look at me on the street. I went from being somebody to being absolutely nobody in 3 days." "You were never a nobody, Evan," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "You were just trying to be someone else." He turned to look at me, and I saw that he was crying. The arrogant, posturing executive was gone, replaced by a broken 34-year-old boy. "Dad," he choked out, wrapping his arms around himself. Can I read the letter again? Please?" I reached into the inner pocket of my cardigan, pulled out the thick manila envelope, and handed it to him. I had not sealed it again. Evan took the heavy cream stationery out with trembling hands. He read his mother's words again, standing in the exact spot where she used to play Chopin. He didn't read it out loud this time. He just read it in silence, the tears falling freely down his face, dripping onto the hardwood floor. When he finished, he carefully folded the letter and pressed it against his chest. He looked up at me, his eyes red and raw. "I didn't just sell it for the money, Dad," Evan whispered, his voice shaking with a terrible vulnerability. "I sold it because I hated it. I hated walking into this house and seeing it. I hated the way you looked at it. I thought you loved her memory more than you loved me. You wouldn't even let me sit on the bench after she died." It was a profound, devastating confession. It was the absolute truth hidden beneath all the layers of greed and vanity. He was jealous of a ghost. I walked across the room and stood in front of him. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure he heard every single word. "No, Evan," I said. "I did not love her more than you. I loved her enough to remember what she tried to teach us. You didn't hate the piano because you thought I loved it too much. You hated the piano because every time you looked at it, it reminded you of a love you could not buy." Evan closed his eyes, a sob tearing through his chest. He collapsed forward, reaching out and burying his face in my shoulder, weeping with the kind of absolute surrender that only comes when you have finally stopped lying to yourself. I did not step back, but I did not wrap my arms around him. I stood perfectly still in the empty parlor, my hands at my sides. I let him cry, but I did not offer him the comfort he was begging for. Some bridges, once burned, leave you standing on opposite sides of the river forever. I did not forgive him. The next morning, I made a phone call. I did not have the movers bring the Steinway back to my house. A monument locked in a dark room serves no one. Instead, I had it transported to the south side of Chicago, to a brick building that Bennett Hale had recently acquired and renovated. The Eleanor Bennett Music School was a free academy for underprivileged children, fully funded by the trust Evan had forfeited. I had them place the 1928 Steinway Model M directly in the center of the main rehearsal hall. I did not put a velvet rope around it. I did not put a "Do Not Touch" sign on the lid. I left the cover open. I stood in the doorway of the rehearsal hall later that afternoon, watching a 7-year-old girl, with scuffed sneakers, sit on the worn mahogany bench. She tentatively reached out and struck a chord. It was clumsy. It was out of tune. It was the wrong note entirely. I closed my eyes, and for a second I could hear Eleanor laughing in the kitchen, clapping her hands together as a young Evan stumbled through his first scale. I walked over to the piano. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I just gently placed my hand on the edge of the bench, right over the spot where the envelope used to be. I listened to the music. My son sold the piano because he thought it was the past. My wife hid the truth inside it because she understood the future. In the end, the old piano did exactly what it had always done. It revealed who was willing to listen and who only cared what the wood was worth. I watched the little girl play, and I knew Eleanor was smiling. Some deals you close because there is no version of yourself you can live with that walks away from the table. I humiliated my own son in front of everyone he cared about. I stripped him of his wealth, his fiancée, and his pride, just to teach him a lesson his mother left behind in a wooden box. Did I go too far? Was I a father protecting a legacy or an old man punishing a son for trying to escape it? Let me know what you honestly think in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.